Thank you, Joan. It's a great pleasure to be here to make so many new friends, and across the southwest of the state at least. I haven't had the chance to look at all the beautiful northern part, but I tend to be obsessed with water and therefore talking to farmers, which I did on Wednesday. I came back saying that it was the best day of my life because I'd had such an engaged and wonderful time talking to people. Water is obviously something you get passionate about if you look at it as a hydrologist, but my passion has increased as I've tried to understand the way that people handle water, the way they manage it. And if you think about who manages it, then it's the farmers who manage the water. We do need a small amount of water for our drinking and our domestic needs and for our jobs here at university, but that's a very tiny amount of water. We need more water in a day for our food than the good people in this room, apart from the farmers who are using water in big quantities, need in a year for their job. You only need about 2.5 to 5 cubic meters of water a year for your job, but you need that amount of water in a day for your food. So the asymmetry between the water in the food chain and the other water. I'm not saying that all the science that's done about water quality in the small water is unimportant. All I'm saying is, please, can we get our eye in on the big water, which is where water security lies globally. So I came up with the idea of embedded water, but another of my passions is trying to communicate and get people to understand, get new ideas. And whereas the word embedded water is the best term for the water needed to produce a ton of something, whether it's a motor car or a ton of wheat, in fact, the term virtual water is easier on the ear and people prefer to have it. So I would like it to be embedded water, but it's virtual water because society likes to hear the term virtual water. So we've got to be aware that if we're going to communicate, we have to somehow go with the flow and try to hold on to the idea and make sure that it doesn't get captured and taken into some domain where it's telling a different story. So these are just a graphic way of showing how you can embed water in different commodities, and some are not so good in terms of health and the environment, and some are rather good in terms of health and the environment, and you can see it's in fact the beef that is the big problem. So the talk this morning is going to be about the role of those who produce food and trade the embedded water, and what the impacts are and who benefits. And in this, I'm pleased to be and honored to be the first in a series of lectures about water and society, water and politics, as well as understanding and making sure that the underlying fundamentals of hydrology and water economics, of course, are also understood. So I'm going to use the lens of virtual water, this fact that it takes 1,000 tons, 1,000 cubic meters of water to grow a ton of wheat. And that if you move that ton of wheat across the world, then places that don't have any water and can't grow their own food invisibly and silently solve their two huge problems of shortage of water and food by importing this ton or many tons of commodities that have an awful lot of water, as it were, embedded in them. And because it's invisible and silent, it's very important, even more important, because if you're any one of you in the room who have had any sort of allocative power, that is, you have resources which you can allocate. You're probably doing it within a set of rules, but nevertheless, there's an awful lot of pressure on you to allocate the resources to a voice which is shouting in your ear, I need the resource. And so you're always facing the competition, the political competition for access to the resources you have. And if one of the problems is feeding your country as a political leader in a poor or even a rich country, and this sort of problem, elemental problem, is solved invisibly, no economic stress at all, because the food is coming in at half cost, because the US and European economies over the past 50 years have been subsidizing the staple food on the world market, and therefore a country which is importing the food is doing it at half cost. So half-cost food solves two elemental problems without any economic stress, and most of all, without any political stress. And it's the absence of political stress which is most important. So the message of the day mainly is that water that we use in society is mainly managed by farmers. It's normal for engineers to get the credit for the water that you can pump and divert, but in practice the input of water with the soil and with all the other inputs is done by the farmers. And they don't get the credit for it, and my belief is that they should, because they have worked miracles in many parts of the world, particularly in the United States, over the past 50 or 60 years, and also in Europe and industrialized countries. So there is a close relationship between the wealth of an economy and its capacity to increase its water productivity. So the farmers are important there at the beginning of the food supply chain. They manage all this water. The water then the food then goes into a local economy or a national economy, or is traded by international companies mainly, and then some of it's processed, and then it goes into supermarkets, and then it goes to consumers. So in this supply chain, we have 90% of the water, and that's the theme of the day, and trying to understand how to help farmers to do even more wonderful things in increasing water productivity, getting the traders and the food processing companies and the seed companies to understand their role in that, in the water security side of things, and then understanding the consumers. And as I said on the first slide, it's getting consumers to understand their role, because they place the demands. And if they eat sensibly and choose food sensibly, then both their own health and that of society is good. So we're in a world of politics, a world of markets, as well as the world of soil and water and agriculture. And in the background, this isn't the structure for the day, but it's just it's quite clear that who owns what, and clearly the ownership of the land and water is in the hands of farmers. Who does what in managing the farm, who controls what, does the farmer control? No, the farmer doesn't control the food supply chain. The food supply chain is in the hands of other people. So understanding that is going to be important if we're going to understand this link between farming, trading, and consumption, and who gets what at the end, both in terms of secure food or profit and so on. They are important issues to address. And I'm very pleased that Ben Russell is in the room, who's a farmer. I normally ask, are there any farmers here? And normally there aren't any farmers here, but I know at least there's 2 farmers here today. There may be more, I hope there are, because we do depend on them in Michigan as well as everywhere else to make us food and water secure. So the idea of virtual water, I do urge any of you scientists to have an idea which gets attention, because it makes life a lot more fun. But you can't, in fact, be sure that it happens quickly. And when I did identify the idea of embedded water in about 1988, not as a consequence of doing my hydrology or my economics, but as a consequence of having to explain the absence of armed conflict over water in the Middle East, where I work a lot. There had been armed conflict over water between Syria and Israel in the 1962, 3 and 4 years. They zapped each other's tractors that were trying to divert water from the Upper Jordan, and then stopped. And there's never been a water war since, and there wasn't one before. And I predict that there will not be water wars in future, because I had to explain its absence, because it was becoming embarrassing by the late 80s. That there had been no water wars, and there were twice as many people in the Middle East as there had been in the early 60s, and yet there was no sign of any hydropolitical tension. And so it was by spotting import data for Egypt, in which one could see that the imports of food from the early 70s were started to go up very, very swiftly, but without any announcement, because it was happening at a point in political economic history when it was coming in at half cost and it wasn't causing any problems even to a not very rich country like Egypt. So I then, for 4 years, called it embedded water, and then one Monday evening at a seminar, a workshop we tend to have them on a Monday evening, the term virtual water came up, and I realized that that was the word that was going to perhaps get the idea to fly, but it didn't fly all that fast, and I did predict at the time that it would take 25 years for it to get through the adoption by the science community, then the gradual adoption by policy people and by the general public as an idea which people talk about whenever they talk about food security. It took 10 years to get it into the science discourse, and by sort of 12 or 13 years, every water minister in the world was aware of the concept. And it was, of course, resisted very severely in the Middle East, because you can't stand up in front of your people and say, "Do not worry, my people. We are short of water and food, but we can easily import food." The person who would say that would be out of power the next day. So the first political concept I introduced you to is that of a sanctioned discourse. A society builds up over time an idea, a suite of ideas which are almost uncontestable. So certain are the people that these are the right ideas. You can bump into them all over not just the world living in poverty, but also the rich countries are quite able to be pointing firmly in the wrong direction for decades. Think energy, think water, and you can see how difficult it is to contradict. So I knew it would be opposed, especially in the Middle East, but as I say, all the conversations in the Middle East these days that we have about water will include the concept of virtual water trade. In fact, the idea was coined in a sense by Gideon Fishelson, who's a late Gideon Fishelson, an Israeli ag economist, and he pointed out that it was very foolish for Israel to be exporting water-intensive crops because they just didn't really have the water to do it, especially with the population rising so quickly. And then embedded water by the late 80s to 1990s, virtual water trade in various articles, but a little message for, I know you're much more professional than I have ever been in my career as senior scientist and junior scientist. I sent it off to Water International as a hastily written concept paper, and was one of the editors put in a referee's comment saying it was a silly idea, and I was hurt by that and withdrew it and didn't in fact stick with it, which, just stick with it, and these silly referees, and you have to tweak it a bit. And so, but I didn't, and so I only realized that something was missing when Allan in about 1999-2000 got in touch and said, "Where did you first publish this idea?" And of course it was in a silly little, not a wonderful journal, Groundwater. I'd been asked to write an editorial, and that was the first time. So I realized that we had a gap in the literature, but the water community is very generous, and they left the idea with me. No one took it over. But I've been worried ever since, of course, that the idea, as I shall explain in a little while when I'm looking through some other ideas, that you can never be sure that an idea which you can see as you intended is rather a good idea will not be seized by an interest group and taken off in another direction. So far, it hasn't been, and so I'm very, very pleased, as I say, that the water science community is generous and has left the identity of the idea with me. But do have such ideas, because you get invitations to have wonderful trips around Michigan and meeting wonderful farmers and so on as one of the positive sides. So I do appreciate the resources that have made that possible. Anyway, a number of other things are going on now for virtual water and trade. There's a book coming out on that and other ideas. Just to give you a perspective on the numbers, before Aaron Hoekstra, based in the Netherlands now at Twente University, needed to have some reference to put into his literature, and I knew that he was trying to put the metrics in on the basis of not very wonderful international data sets, FAO and World Trade Organization. I do admire modelers. Many things I'd love to do, speak Chinese, be a modeler, but I can't do either of those. But and the reason I can't do modeling is that the courage they have to go forward on the basis of data sets, which in the case of trade and this sort of thing are not really strong at all. But until Allan started to bring these numbers out, I guessed that we needed about 1,000 cubic meters a year per person for our food, and perhaps another 100, that's a bit high, very high for our domestic consumption, and perhaps another 100 for the average job. And so I came up with the number 1,200 cubic kilometers a year. So when Allan came out with this number of 1226, I stopped being a good scientist. I was not critical of that number at all because it fitted the guess so well. So I'm getting, since if you're pushing into areas of analysis which no one has ventured yet, I'm often, as I'm 2 or 3 times during this talk, I'll give you a number which hasn't been tested by research, but I've had some experience and find that often one has, through just being in the game for a long time, must be like running a farm here in Michigan. You just know everything so well. You don't need all of the monitoring. You just actually know because you've been part of it. Not totally true that, we could discuss it. But anyway, this suite of diagrams, just 5 countries to give an example, some examples, show the top 3 lines are the internal water, and the bottom 2 are the external water, the water coming in from outside. So most countries in the world are net virtual water importers, especially because of the food component. So 210 or so countries in the world, 160 odd, I would guess, but then that's the first time I'm guessing. It may be 140, maybe 170, but the vast majority of the countries in the world are net food importers, often massive food importers in proportion to their population, such as the UK, Italy, and Germany, and in Europe, but only France in Europe is a net food exporter. So the big markets for food, even, and have been for 100 odd years, in Europe, despite our increase in productivity. So we've got the top, this is the domestic water needs. You can see how small that is compared with all the rest of the needs. Then the national water in agricultural products is that, in cubic meters, in industrial products is that. Then the water coming in from outside is this proportion, and the industrial water coming in. And that's the average for the world, with quite a bit of trade going on. But of course, the most trade goes on between the industrialized countries. So this is an example of a poor country in Africa, where you can see that its water footprint for food is massive, locally sourced, very little trade, and a very tiny use of water domestically. India, a BRICS economy, it has, again, quite a modest water footprint for food. That's partly because its agriculture is reasonably efficient, and very efficient, of course, in parts, and they're vegetarians. So not so much water goes into a vegetarian diet, but not too much trade. Fortunately, 1.2 billion Indians are mainly self-sufficient in food and water. Were it not so, the world would be, I guess, at war over water. So bless the Indians for being so industrious in terms of their farming and water productivity in agriculture. Brazil, another completely different BRICS economy. Brazil is the water tower of the world, and South Africa is the water tower of the world. They eat a lot of beef, and so they've got a bigger water footprint. Obviously, much more domestic water, and are engaged in quite a bit of trade. And of course, Brazil, along with the United States, you are the 2 pivotal global virtual water trading exporting countries. Please do reflect on it, because your energy policy matters to the globe. If you do too much ethanol production with corn, it does tighten things up. Brazil can almost do anything at once because it's got so much water, but it tends to produce its ethanol from sugar. And the United States, you can see, is an industrialized country, one of the sort of 35 or more OECD countries, and it has a typical big trading footprint and quite a big, that footprint is already big, and plus that makes it very big. So you have a big water footprint. Despite having very efficient agriculture, you have a big water footprint, which is clearly twice the size of the global average. It's coming down, doing good things, but it's still quite big. And in a way, you can afford it. You've only got 300 million people. You're going to go to 400. And you're absolutely safe in water terms, but the globe, the world does depend on you. I don't know whether you like that or not, but we do. Certainly Europe does. And you could argue, been very responsible global food traders over the past 50 or 60 years, and before that we're doing it, and you kept Britain and other countries in food for over 150 years. So there's a long tradition in it, but if you were to swing all the water into producing energy, it would be as devastating as the opposite that happened in the 1940s and 50s when we mechanized farming, when 20% of the agricultural area was for feed, for traction and trucks and so on. At that point, we had the double whammy positive, because all the water that had been used for pulling and tugging suddenly wasn't needed, and all that area could be used for food. But if we go in the other direction and take water and food and put it into energy, it's not a good direction. In Europe, we only dabbled with that for a few years, but you've been dabbling with it for now 20 or 30. But last week, I think you had a move in Congress or in one of the places in Washington to say that there should be a reduction in the subsidy for corn for bioethanol. So we are linking now water and energy, the global system, and this is very important. This is a nice graphic which shows the world. You can imagine this is the Americas, and this is Africa, and this is Asia. And you can see how domestic water, you can see, is quite a big footprint in Canada and the United States and the European countries. But in Africa, there's this low water footprint in domestic water. You would think that it might be the same for food, but you've seen how Tanzania has a big footprint, and that's because it has the farmers don't produce so much food per unit of water. Their productivity of water is low, so you find that a water footprint for food in Tanzania is about the same size as that for the United States. Not because they're better fed in Tanzania, but with respect to water, they use about the same amount of water. They get half a ton to 1 ton of grain per hectare here, whereas up here we get anything from 4 to 8 tons in the various grain crops in the United States. So this is the miracle of increasing the water productivity, which farmers do. Farmers do it with lots of different inputs, but it's the farmers who engage with the soil and use either the rain-fed water or they add some additional irrigation water. And then it's traded across the world, and as I think I said, the countries that are in a lot of actual and potential exporters in South America, here we got them, and here, and France is the only one that's an exporter. So that means the asymmetry is greater than with energy. There are about 30 countries have some sort of hold on the oil and gas, whereas with food, in the background, the asymmetry is even greater, which we are not aware of and we don't make a fuss about. So farmers manage water. 90%, as I've said, of all global green and blue water. I'm going to use the terms green and blue. It offends the hydrologists because they've got different terms for it, but just as embedded water doesn't sing and dance, nor do the terms of hydrology. And although it may be offensive, I know that it matters that you communicate rather than are precious about your terminology. So green water is the water in the root zone, which I find is a good way of getting it across as well. And that's the majority water that produces food. Blue water is the water that comes from the groundwater or from the streams or the rivers. and that's water which we apply as irrigation water. I've started to conjure something that 36.6 because in most of the places that I work in, they have 6 inches of rain and pull 36 inches of depth out to irrigate, whereas in this beautiful state, it's the other way around. You've got 36 inches of rain and you just pull 6 inches out. And so this is a wonderfully rich water environment, not just your freshwater lakes and all that, but this soil water environment. And the soils are not perhaps top rate, but as someone told me many years ago, most of the best agricultural productivity comes out of second-class land, not out of first class. It all depends how you manage the inputs and especially the water. So farmers manage all the green water, because we can't use green water, that stuff in the root zone, for anything else, and they also manage 70% of the blue water. So the other 30% of the blue water is used for drinking and jobs and other stuff. The environment should be in there somewhere, but we'll get that in a moment. So this is Peter Rogers' Harvard article a few years, 3 years ago in Scientific American. It does very nicely get across how much water we leave in the environment, in the terrestrial environment. All the green water on the land surface is pretty well left there, but we do take 5% out. And out of the blue water environment, we take a much smaller proportion, and we do leave an awful lot of water there. Hopefully, we leave it in a good environmental status, but that's the work of many people in this college and department to take an interest in the water quality side. But I'm interested in this small volume of water, which is mainly green water, but so this dark blue is also the blue water, which is taken out of it's a very small proportion. And one thing that hydrologists haven't helped us with is saying how much water there is that's usable. Over 13,000 years or so, farmers have gone out and found where it is. Our knowledge of potential for agriculture is where the farmers have been, not where the hydrologists have said there is potential water. And whether it's Shiklemanov or anyone else, we haven't got a set of numbers which we can use to tell us anything about policy from the hydrological community. It is from the agricultural community where we know where good farming is going on and bad farming. And of course, the bad farming may be just because people are poor. This diagram, I sometimes find it works. This is fresh water, the blue water, and the soil water, the root zone water. And we need to be water secure, we need 10% of the water in domestic and industrial and 90% of the water in food. And we can either you have irrigated crops or rain-fed crops. This I call small water, not because it's unimportant, because I haven't got a better word for it, but if anyone can please tell me if there's a better word than small. And big water is the water in the food supply chain. Now, this water can be high cost, and people might even be prepared to pay high prices for it, but not always. This has always got to be low cost or no cost. And the farming community, although I'm saying bless them, bless them, bless them, they do like to see no cost water. And because they think it's a free input, it's rather like air, and we know we can screw up the air as well. So the society is beginning to shift in what it thinks about value in environmental resources. So in a country like Egypt, we find that they've got plenty of fresh water in the Nile, and they used to have plenty of water for the whole economy, but now they've got a gap, so they have to come to the global system to meet the deficit. They don't have any soil zone water or root zone water at all to any extent. The United Kingdom, my place, you can see that we, without knowing it or thinking about it at all, use still the vast majority of our green water. We can only use it in agriculture, but we don't even think about it as part of the water budget. And yet you can produce a ton of stuff from green water, which is the same value as a ton of stuff from blue water. So why we don't consider green water in the budgets, the water budgets, I'm very puzzled. FAO is just beginning to, which is interesting. Michigan is must be a bit like this. I just put this on somewhere, but you can see Michigan has got, and then it's a water surplus, so it's a net. I haven't done the numbers, but because the idea of virtual water has been generated in Europe and hasn't taken off yet in the United States, because it takes a while for ideas to get into the Egyptian government as well as into the US scientific world. You can see you can solve the small water problems with desalination and recycling. And if we, I haven't got the UAE on, but I have sometimes, and you can see that it doesn't even have enough water for the small water. And you can, a country like Egypt, which used to be self-sufficient up to about the 60s, is now bringing water from all over the world, and you can compare the water efficiency in the different places and then show that if you're thinking about maximizing your revenue generation, then you should be thinking about these things. Although, having said that, I understand that farmers are worried about 1,000 other things necessarily than optimizing water use. They optimize it automatically when they increase, or they improve it automatically if they increase yield. So this is why perhaps we don't think so much about water efficiency, water use efficiency. Just to give you a few thoughts about what's happening across the world, between 1961, when a lot of international data sets started, and now, you can see the developed countries in terms of calories per day, which is normally a cubic meter produces a calorie. You find that this is the developed countries trend. This is the threshold for national food security conceptually across the globe. And we have a world increase, and that's good. Asia's done very well, but sub-Saharan Africa clearly has not. So sub-Saharan Africa is the problem. So really what we're asking, will there be enough water? We've seen how small the volumes of water are compared with what's available. And water is not accessible in many places for agriculture because of lots of other terrain and temperature and other conditions. So we still, but is it going to be enough for, we are now close to 7 billion people, we're going to perhaps go to 9. Those of you who've lived as long as I have remember the time when we used to, 9 billion is nothing, we used to worry about 20 billion. And that 20 billion would, but the demographers, bless them, took thought in the late 80s and early 90s and said, no, it's just going to be either 8.5, 10.5 or 12.5, and people are settling on, I tend to prefer 8, but you can see my arguments depend on being optimistic, but the pessimists are pushing it hard towards 9 at the moment. But you can see how the imprecision of estimating procedures are so weak that you can, if you say 9 long enough, then everyone believes the 9, and okay, about 9. So that's going to be caused by people eating more calories and more meat as they get richer, as well as those demographic numbers. So some people argue that food production needs to double, or at least grain production at least needs to double. So we need more water for food if practices don't change, but of course there's lots of evidence that practices are changing and can change. So in order to get all this together, we need everyone in all this long food chain. The consumers eat sensibly, the traders and food manufacturers need to have the same idea that water is valuable, not only in terms of they might go out of business if they can't get water, but that the environment is going to be impacted by misuse of water, and we need the farmers to be on side as good stewards of water. So we have the idea of shared values, which I shall end the talk with later on. So climate change, which is not my business, but there are going to be places where it's going to be bad for economic as well as climate reasons. Now, these slides are from International Water Management Institute, who do give big thought to this sort of thing, and they're very useful in showing such things as the World Bank lending for irrigation. So you can see there has been some reflexiveness in the organizations that have the power to allocate resources to building dams. In the United States, people say cynically, well, that's just because every dam that could possibly have been built was built and they had to stop. But then there are other people who say, no, it's because Jimmy Carter said that we shouldn't build any more dams. And of course, he lost that spectacularly lost that battle because, the path dependence of American thinking on water at that time was hydraulic mission. We've got to do more and more. But lots of things happen in society. You've got to track them very carefully. And you can see that there is a tendency for it currently to be going up, because in sub-Saharan Africa, they only have perhaps 6% of what they could, benefits that they could get from storage and hydropower. And so there certainly it isn't one size fits all. Stopping dams, taking them down is the stage of things in the United States. Putting some dams in, if they're sensible in Africa, is perfectly reasonable. And this is the area of irrigation that has been increased during that time. So mobilizing blue water has been done. 30% of 30% of production and 70% of blue water that's used is in agriculture doing that, including Michigan has contributed to that over the past 30 or 40 years. Now, something which I could dwell on for the rest of the talk, but must just do in 3 seconds, is price spikes. Price spikes, commodity price spikes are driven by energy price spikes. So when the price of gas goes up to $149 a barrel, as it did in July 2008, people get very, 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 very frightened. You can see the prices weren't as high as they were in the 70s. Those of us that remember the 70s, it was a time of very serious price spikes in oil, but the food price spikes just mirrored them. The price of food has been falling for 1,000 years. It's certainly been falling for 200, and you can see if you were thinking that in this price spike things were going to do that, they haven't. The trend from 1,000 years is still in play until 3 years ago. Is it still in play? I can't tell, but certainly the speculation and the reading of the market situation is not driven by rational people. We know that people doing finance are not rational. So we could be sure that if they're doing something with land and water, it'll not be rational. I remember this price spike in 1996, which some in the room may remember. That was because the Food Trade Organization kicked in and there were a couple of droughts, and again speculators got worried. And I remember going to a friend in LSE, London School of Economics, and saying, "This is it. It wasn't this, but at least it was going to be that." And he said, "No, it'll be down next year." And he, who knew nothing much about farming, was dead right. It did come down. And so we've had these two. I mean, we haven't got the present one, which is up here, the 2011 one. Yeah, we're in the middle of that. Well, what the outcome is going to be, it's been a roller coaster for farmers, good news for some, very bad for others in the dairy industry. But if you're growing corn, it's been a good 2 years. And then there's, if you think about an environmental indicator, then of course the Living Planet Index takes things downwards rather than upwards. And then if you can see at the bottom, we've got sub-Saharan Africa activities still bumping along the bottom. So growth in yields, this is magic. This is growth in yields means growing the water productivity, because every time you get an extra ton of grain or bushel of grain, or 100 bushels of grain more per acre, then you are taking the trend up like this. One remembers being, living at this period and not knowing that this was going to happen, and now living in this period, what's going to happen? People can be pessimistic, but when I go around the farms of southwest Michigan in the past couple of days, the people talk about increases of yield of 20%. This is obviously technological, and the whole reason a lot of this has happened is technological. And good management, different inputs, mix of inputs. So this is why the farming community that has the interfaces with the environment to achieve this is so important, and why your resources, water resources and land resources here in Michigan, can only be more important in future because the global system is having a tough time in terms of meeting its food needs. China, fortunately, did nearly as well. Latin America has done well and will do better in future. but sub-Saharan Africa not doing so well. So we have a world where different things are happening. Brazil is mainly responsible for that Latin American story, and it is a place which you will be watching, are watching, because it is helping the world to be secure. Soya and sugar and corn, those, the US and Brazil, if you do wise things, we're all right. If you don't, we're in trouble globally. So some people are pessimists and say the yields are going to decline, but it's also possible to more than double yields. So we're in a world of uncertainty. So whose ideas matter in managing water? The ideas of science, all of you people, or the ideas of society? You're all consumers at the same time, so you've got two parts of your brain trying to cope with things, where we don't use observed science, we use constructed knowledge. We construct knowledge helped by society's ideas, and recent history, and by the marketeers as well. And ideas and discursive processes are what enables us to have an opinion about something, and for allocators of resources, policymakers, to be able to decide to do things. So ideas in the governance processes and the problems of engaging with the assumptions and expectations of consumers, because consumers can get things changed. A little thought, the first failure of capitalism, people say it hasn't failed, but it's having a struggle at the moment, was over labor. We used to commoditize labor and slavery and that sort of thing. So consumers and people in society eventually decided that was a bad thing. So it was good that we shifted away from doing that, so all the people that were doing it. So we can get things wrong and we can move in the other direction. 100 years later, the second failure of capitalism was discovered to be the environment. We were getting the environment wrong. By 1960, 70, and good people in this part of the world, Silent Spring and such, started to point society in a different direction. The certainties we were sure about were no longer certain. We were really uncertain about the future. So we have to think about society shifting its opinions, and now we need the ideas of consumers to be influencing the supply chain to make sure that good things are happening all the way through that supply chain. So science is useful, prediction, explanation, and could influence society and the political economy. It predicts, is modeling science, but there are different ways of science knowing. Those modeling sciences, which are mainly represented in this room, are important. They help us understand the underlying fundamentals. But we can also be looking for explanation of why people decided to not make the right cars in Detroit. That's something to do with society and not to do with underlying economic fundamentals, because the economic fundamentals were pointing in the opposite direction. And of course, we can use science to influence. So three sorts of science: modeling science, social and political theory, explanatory science, and activist science. And my journey has been from modeling science to explanatory science to activist science. So the activists do help us point in the right direction, in my view, although they're chided by big corporations for not being responsible, and they should be made responsible and so on. But as I'll explain, we need all three voices in there. So three types of science, and they have different views of what is relevant, what methods they use, what is truth. Truth is the point at which we mutually decide to seek no further. When funds stop, you stop seeking, and truth is out there, but you can't get at it. So that's a good definition for modeling science, but it's also the way that society gets at something which they regard as constructed truth. And what knowledge they look at, in that the modeling sciences tend to look at just what is measurable. And you can quite see that human psyche and social solidarities of a different sort can be completely ignorant or unwilling to see the underlying science. So constructed knowledge, I came up with this idea, will always overwhelm observed science. And thought that was new about 10, 15 years ago, but then I realized that Marx said the abstract always overwhelms the concrete, which is a similar idea, which is 150 years old. So the abstract always overwhelms the concrete. And then I I don't know whether there are any politicians in the room, but one can always get them on side with this one. And I believe it. Politicians were invented to deal with ambiguity, which is always associated with uncertainty. Modeling scientists deal with risk, which can be captured with easy-peasy numbers and the language of probability. And easy-peasy numbers are about things you can measure rather than about things that are in the uncertain world beyond. So politicians get into the game because intuitively they know that this is where power lies and where there's much uncertainty, lots and lots of tough things happen. They all fail in the end. So we should bless them for going into this game. If they're honest through and through, then we have got a great story. If they're not honest through and through, of course, we have people dealing with uncertainty that have a field day. So most scientists avoid the excitement of uncertainty. We're just in this little world of probability. So three sorts of science: the empirical, analytical, the interpretative, and the liberatory. But put in modeling science, explanatory science, and active science, you can see different types of knowledge, different types of outcome are in those. And damn it, we don't speak to each other much, not enough. So just to explain that dilemma to some extent with respect to the idea of sustainability, which is a term which has been causing people a lot of trouble over the last 30 or 40 years. But if you think about water through time being used in the economy, in irrigated agriculture, let's say, the ecosystem people and the economists in a water-rich place like Michigan, that's the first time I've ever been able to say in a water-rich place, and I've always had to say, like not here, but in a water-rich place like Michigan, yeah, you could, with care, you could increase. I'm not wanting to contradict the precautionary hydrologists and other people in the room, but yeah, you could use more water. And that's because you're very rich in water. But when you go out there, not in Michigan, fortunately, although in some places this is happening, but just in a few pockets. Society gets on with doing the job and it pulls water out. And I mean, this is in places where the 636 is you're pulling 36 inches out and only getting 6 inches of rain. This is what they do in those places. So they really smash into the environment. And people, the people in doing this stuff are not interested in what's in this stuff. People can say hydrology and numbers and trends and wisdom. It doesn't get across. So what we need is a discursive political process that could lead to the convergence of these two trajectories. So socioeconomic development, getting richer, being able to compensate farmers from doing what they're doing, and perhaps you can get other pressures, even regulations in place. You could start putting water markets to get people, but water markets are from A to Z political. You might be able to get this to happen. So that's this is what should happen. This is what can happen. And this is what you might do to get the right thing to happen in future. With integrated water resource management, which is a political process, it's got a few things to do with technology and science in it, but it's a political process because management means allocation. And we should therefore call it integrated water resource allocation and management. And allocation is very political. That's what politics is about, allocating resources. Taking them, having to give them back, or keeping them and getting into conflict over them. Well, change is normal, and I just want to give you a little bit of other theory which is very relevant to the water history of the United States, but the world generally. And this theory is modernity theory, and it's the result of the green people getting us to point in the right direction, in my view, in our neoliberal industrialized societies. But we have a path dependence which once you've invested in all the infrastructure, it's hard to pull out. And once you've got infrastructure and an income, it's hard to get farmers to think that they should be doing anything other than they're doing. They're doing the right thing, they're producing food, God's work, and so on. So this little diagram is, I concocted some time ago, and you can see that the hydraulic mission is somewhere in the middle of the diagram. We had a pre-modern phase up to the late 19th century, and then we got into industrial modernity. And with respect to use of agricultural water, irrigation water, we got into the hydraulic mission, which I think is a term invented by Mark Reisner, who famously said, water flows uphill to money and power, because all you have to do is have enough money and power to give money to engineers, and engineers will pull the water uphill. But you can see that something happened as a result of this. Was all the politicians and engineers just were solving society's problems, and no one was thinking about the uncertainties that there might be with respect to the environment, because the environment didn't have a voice. So the green movement got going. I'm now in the heart of the lakes, Great Lakes, and I believe this is where the green movement started. If you speak in California, you have to say it started there, but I understand that you lay claim to it here, and there's lots of evidence to say that that is the case. And as a consequence, the discourse in society changed, and very pivotal books were written, and ideas changed. And the people here said, no, we're not in an era of certainty, we're actually in an era of uncertainty. And society actually moved into that position as a consequence of the discourse that went on. This is when Jimmy Carter was in power for the last 4 years of the 70s, and he tried to get that to happen, but he couldn't, because the Corps of Engineers and the Bureau of Reclamation were very powerful on the Hill, and they just laughed it off. And various senators and House people were waiting for the next dam, and so the path to penance. But it was lots and lots of politics went on. Jimmy Carter lost power, but that's what politics is about. And so we've got this now. We've got in this pleasant phase, which we can call in. I know you're hydrological scientists, you've got all your theory and you like it a lot. Well, this is social theory, and it does help to communicate, in my view. So standing back from it, you can see that there have been three that I know have happened. I've observed them, I've lived with them. So we've got the third paradigm, which is the environmental paradigm. That's the environment and stopping the dams and all that sort of thing was the 80s. It's still there. And then in the 90s, if you lived in this water world, it was all about the value of water and pricing and water markets. Still there. And then in the fifth paradigm, just up to 2010 or so now, is about participation. So those are the three the phases of it. And the characteristic of this late modern period is uncertainty and awareness of risk. So sometimes this period is called the risk society. And if you look at the newspapers, the serious ones, even the non-so-serious, every page has got at least one or more worries for us with respect to something or other, but especially with respect to the environment. One of the most interesting things about this diagram is that we have this and this. This really only involves about 1.3 billion people in the OECD countries, because the big battalions in India, China, Turkey, and Egypt, and elsewhere are still on their hydraulic mission, and lots of other poor countries in Africa, if they can be given international assistance. So if you've been in the World Bank during this period, it's been a hell of a time. If you read John Briscoe's recent articles, you can see that he lived through that, and he should look at this diagram as far as I'm concerned and explain. He was in this for about 20 years, knowing himself that it should be this, especially in the places where he was lending money or was responsible for water issues, whereas and around the tables in Washington, the rich countries who gave the money were doing this. So you can see there, do read his interview with Jerry Delli-Prescolli in Water Policy, because John is a wordsmith beyond, he's a good engineer, economist, but not a good political scientist, and he speaks and writes with extraordinary fluency. So it's a real page turner. So do have a look at that. But remember it in this context here. So risk and uncertainty, risk, the status of knowledge, and uncertainty, decision-making condition, probability, or ambiguity. Science copes with the first, but not with the second. So politics was invented, or just comes in to fill the gap of the uncertain world. Yeah, so water demand is determined by the consumers, getting back to the consumers, who have beliefs and expectations that are based on experience, cultural preferences, history, and not on science. So the assumptions of consumers and how they're manipulated or reached is very, very important. And we have extravagant consumers in the north driving things and optionless irrigators in the south. The irrigators can't stop irrigating in the south because they die, so no government's going to tell them to stop. So we have a whole lot of things in place which lead to path-dependent circumstances. I just want a message for science, water science in this university and other universities on this wonderful continent. My experience has been that I started out in here with hydrology. I then found that economics was important. When I created this diagram about 20 years ago, I was rather interested in economics, and anyway, virtual water came out of here somewhere. And this one is environment and development, so the contest between users and the environmental protection. Then on this side we have, so these are the modeling sciences. You put numbers on these, and if you can measure things, then they're happy doing their science. Over on this side, they're looking at anthropology, social theory, politics, international relations, and law. So this is the science discourse. Do we speak to each other? Not enough. But these people over here try to understand this. I argue that people down here don't try to understand that, yet sometimes the messages which they have are extremely important. These little blobs are ears. Ears can be open or closed. Ears can hear, and when they hear, the brain decides what to do with the knowledge. So you can't be sure that the idea that you generate here is going to go straight up to decision-making space. It just goes around in a whole lot of, we've got a public meeting here, but it could be in the media or in individual discourse or in international conference or something. And it takes, my idea of virtual water, I said, would take 25 years to get up into, not a detailed operational mode, but some mode in which it was taken into account to understand how things are. And we're on course. It took 10 years to get the idea into here. It's taken 20 years to get it accepted in any informed, but not in uninformed discourses. And it's starting to be present at any international meeting where we talk about water security. So we have science and the political landscape in which consumers are embedded, underlying fundamentals, explanatory social science, so science into policy. So we need to educate all the people in these boxes how to communicate their science into policy. That should be a semester in every science program, in my view. And although it doesn't seem logical to an overcrowded syllabus, it is, otherwise departments will close down because they will be not able to communicate what they're saying, in my view. The other thing that's interesting, there's a bit of path dependence in this as well, in that just about 5 years ago I thought about this and realized there are thousands, perhaps 1 million or 2 in this box, because the engineering that's gone on over the century has been focused on this, and so lots of water engineers are in fact water policy makers as well as they become more senior. But if you think about these boxes, I know all the people that do, nearly all the people globally that do agricultural economics, and I certainly know all the people that do international relations and water. And it's not difficult because they're just, there just used to be about 5 or 10, and now there are perhaps about 30, and they generally do it part-time. So don't be worried if you're in this box, but you do need to shape up, in my view. So the reason, which we'd like to think in science that's what we deal with, the underlying fundamentals cannot prevail against the juggernaut of consumers' emotions. I've never shown this slide in the United States. It's a Canadian view of Americans. So I don't know if you're Canadians. So this was 2008, the height of the energy price spike, $148 a barrel, near $3 a gallon, $3 a gallon petrol, gas. You can see the corporations squeezing the energy out, and these people, even George Bush said that we have become addicted to cheap energy. So, and if you be reminded, you had cheap energy from 1900 to 1972, $2 a barrel energy. That was free. I mean, that was free energy. And so we've got big cities and a whole lot of things which we will regret and are already regretting in Detroit. And what did the oil companies do in the 1970s when it went up? Lots of green things were happening. Jimmy Carter was encouraging a whole lot of things to happen. And of course, as soon as the prices fell again, and they were made to fall because the big oil, pleasing big auto, just decided to exploit the oil resources of the North Sea and the North Slope, and down came to a higher price than $2, but in real dollar terms or old dollar terms, it was still back to. So for 35 years, we've been doing in this path dependence determination done the wrong thing for another 35 years. Are there any energy people in the room? I don't know, but I hope you get a little bit of the message. So it's very hard for leaders in democracies to do anything about that. So corporations serving the addictions of society, racing to deplete the second trillion. So if the private sector isn't wise, we can get into deep trouble in society. So just as scientists have different ways of knowing, so does society. And creating shared values is going to be a little theme. So 4 ways of knowing. We can be at breakfast time in the morning, and then we can either go to the state for our employment, or local government, or the police or something, or we can go to the market, to jobs in retailing or manufacturing or whatever, or IT, or we can, perhaps a few of us, go to work in these civil movements and the unions. I use .gov.org.com because that's quite a modern categorization, but this is exactly the theory that Mary Douglas put in place 20 years before. So the theorizing in social theory it's got something. So 45% of it in neoliberal societies go to work in government, and 45% go to work in the private sector, and a few are unemployed, and a few are in the other sector. And if people come along and shrink the state, and it comes back again, but there seems to be something elemental in the neoliberal way of doing things, mixed economies, capitalist way of doing things, which does in fact tend to have a lot of public services and other things done in that other sector. And how do we communicate? Well, the citizens are both voters and consumers. We consume from the market and we vote for the government. And that yellow stuff was put in place over hundreds of years with blood and treasure of unimaginable death involved in putting those rules in place. Now we've got them, and we wonder why the other people in the world find it difficult to put them in place. Between us and the market, we've got obviously we consume what we get from the market. They provide us with goods and services, and they also provide jobs and pensions, as does, of course, the government. So there's quite a complicated relationship we have with both the government and with the market. It isn't as simple as it's sometimes projected by the political classes. But there is really tough, long-established rules in place in both of those interfaces. Whereas with the high-minded .org people, all they have is the voice, a little bit of voice. And yet they do point us in, whether it's Wilberforce or the voice of Silent Spring, they are the moments, or they are the voices which in fact get society to think and to move in the right direction. And then you can predict how these different categories will think. These are risk managing people. They've been doing it. They manage the risks. These are risk avoiding, and these are risk taking. So you can see, if you sit around the table with these three communities, you can pretty well know a lot of things that are going to happen at a meeting. So you've got society with its addictions, not a safe group of people to vote or choose. Then you've got the corporations, and then you've got the government. Without many options, the emotions of consumers overwhelm what they might like to do in terms of the right thing, and then the civil movements. The civil movement people know best without power. The government people know best with power. Well, in fact, John Briscoe, in a way, for a period early in his life, he was in the bottom right, and then he got to the bank, and he certainly knew best with power. So most of us who produce, trade, and consume are ignorant of these underlying fundamentals that we've been talking about. We're locked in path-dependent behavior and markets. And note, this long food supply chain is all in the private sector. So if we don't understand the private sector, and we're not wanting to engage with it. So, I try to engage with Cargill and Bunge and the people in those ABCD companies because they are so essential in that trading system, and Walmart also the same. So we got this, we've got those 4 ways of doing things, and then we've got the 4 ways here, and you can see that on the right-hand side, we've got subsistence farming, and then urban food consumers, and small farmers, some market participation, and then we come down into the commercial farmers, small-scale corporate farmers, and then international food commodity traders, the non-brand and the brands, agribusiness brands, and then the supermarkets. All of that is in the private sector. So if we're going to do anything about global food security, we've got to relate to the private sector, and we've got to relate to farmers. I'm beginning to realize you've got to think about the rules as well. So accounting rules that are made in New York and other places need to be taken into account. So a great research project if anyone's got the money and a few spare graduate students. So a few thoughts on water footprints and how we should engage. You can do it like try to get through to the media and not get through, but so in our communication we need to understand the language. So my book is all in the language for the general reader. It's not there for the scientists. So if you find things that are slightly nuisance because they're talking about green water rather than effective rainfall or something, bear with me. Effective rainfall does not communicate. And I wanted to, but I've tried it and it doesn't. So we must expect the political landscape to be determining. The consumers are embedded in this political landscape. We must expect their opinions to change over time, slowly, and rarely quickly. And we must expect there to be different types of governance. So we saw those 3 .gov.org.com, and if you put it into this alignment, we have these people, these entities do things to civil society. And so what's the difference between government and governance? Have you ever thought about that and been able to come with a half-sentence explanation? This is it. That's government, and that is governance. And there we are, it's done. It's obviously more nuanced, but at least you know what it could be, what it should be, and it will be different in different places. And then you have, and this of course is the dangerous relationship here, the military-industrial alliance identified by Eisenhower, but big auto, big pharma, big oil, are all very potentially dangerous alliances. Can lead us for decades in the wrong direction. So we need to make sure that the private sector is not only obeying the rules of accounting laid down for it, but it's also wanting to do the right thing itself. So we can have a nicely balanced neoliberal democratic situation, or we can have a common southern situation where the .gov is much more powerful or an authoritarian. Now they're not tested, they're just illustrative explanatory ideas. So what are the big ideas that society needs to know? The role of consumption behavior of water users in the north about wasting water through overconsumption and throwing water and throwing food away. In the south, how to use irrigation water and soil more effectively, but also in Michigan, using irrigation water and the soil water even more effectively than you are already. The trajectory is still fine, but it needs to be, the 2 words which I wished I'd invented as a combination is sustainable intensification. Isn't it marvelous? Sustainability, intensive, put them together. That's what we need to do, stewardship with intensification. So we need the farmers to care a bit about, or a lot about, stewardship, as well as about improving the returns to water and everything else that they put in as inputs. So are you a 5 cubic meters a day person, eating a lot of beef, or a 2.5 cubic meters a day person as a good veggie? I'm not saying you should stop eating meat, I'm just saying you should perhaps get down to 3.5 cubic meters of water by eating less beef. And that's perfectly possible. You'd be healthier, and the environment would breathe a big sigh of relief if we took the foot off the meat-eating activity. So we have a choice to even halve the water footprint of an individual or a society. Think about this in terms of India. India, bless them, mainly vegetarian, so one always asks Indian friends, are you and your family going to stay vegetarian? Because the world depends on you to do that, and because there are going to be 600 million more of them. The Chinese, please do not be too critical of the Chinese, because they've done the world the biggest favor in water demand management that has ever been done. They have taken 300 million people out of the population of their country, and that's 5% of the world's population. It's the population of the United States. So there are 300 million people not needing 3.5 or 4 cubic meters of water a day. And if they hadn't done that, they would certainly be on the world market for it, and we would be having a level of pressure on the global system. And certainly at that point, Michigan will have to try and even more improve its water and land productivity because of that situation. So there's many things globally out there that are massively important, that are nothing to do with our technology, but to do with society and human behavior. And there are places where Africa is going to double, the Middle East is going to double. So we need many things such as have happened in China, but you either achieve that with a draconian decision of government, or you get it through people getting rich and not wanting more than 1 or 2 children. I've tried to explain why people are stuck with not valuing water, and this is my little venture into the sort of anthropology and stuff which I'm not expert in. But if you look at the consumption of water in cubic meters per day, you know, where our food is getting up to well, more than that in some countries, perhaps between 5 and 6 cubic meters per day. Way back in primitive times, 500,000 years ago, we were obviously living more simply, and we were just browsing and gathering and weren't eating much meat because we hadn't got tough enough and skilled enough to throw stones to shoo the other people off, or animals off that were going to eat that dead creature. And then we came down a bit here because we started a bit of farming and ate more more crops, or some crops and then more. And then we advanced in the Neolithic. We got to a little bit of irrigation, and then in the last 200 years. So this is in log scale time along the bottom. So 500,000 years altogether, the last 200 years. You can see how we've dramatically increased the blue water component of our average personal footprint. So as human individuals, for most of our evolution, we've not been aware of anything but the 3 liters of water that we drink. All the food that we got was just browsing, and eventually we started to kill and hunt animals. But so we've got nothing in our biology and our evolved psyche which would tell us that embedded water is there. It's just, we just got no way of knowing. So that seems to partly explain. But our lack of awareness of the doubling. So we could say we've about doubled our personal water footprint in 500,000 years. That's not bad. And perhaps even in the past 300 or 400 years. So things are different in this industrial period. But water is nothing. You know, if you put this on an arithmetic scale, water is just a little bit of doubling. Look at the energy. I mean, energy is the big issue. We need to think about ways of not racing off in the direction that we have with respect to energy, or we do need to do it in a sustainable way. So do you all use 2.5 or 5? Are you good meat eaters, or perhaps a little more virtuous bean eaters? Beans are good, you see, and beef is bad in terms of liters per calorie. And then you can have different footprints for the different nations. Thoughts on the question. The emotion-rich political landscape is more determining than science knowledge. Doesn't mean that science knowledge is unimportant, but science knowledge is, uncommunicated science knowledge is not very important. You need to know how to communicate the knowledge. So we must learn about these political landscapes. We must understand consumption behavior. We must enhance human resources and create jobs with high returns. You solve water problems by educating people. Think Singapore. Singapore only has 5% of the water it needs. It has to import another 5% to meet its blue small water needs. It imports all its food. It's a place in the world where every year people in June or July beat their way to talk about water by the thousand. So it's possible to be absolutely destitute of water, and by having invested in human resources, completely changed. So this is a geophysical research news, and you can see that all of those scientists are from the environmental scientists, from the underlying fundamentals people, so they are beginning to look at these things, highlighted in red all those engineering departments. And then China. The Politburo of China is not full of social scientists or social theorists, it's full of engineers. The top guy, the president, the secretary of the party, was educated at the Department of Water Conservancy Engineering. And the Prime Minister was the Department of Geology and Minerals. And all the rest, except one who's an economist, are engineers. And even the economist was educated at an engineering school. So we've seen how important it is understanding governance, that we understand the deluded consumers, and especially when the underlying fundamentals are invisible and we haven't got the skill to bring them out and show people. So are you a 2.5 cubic meters a day person or a veggie? Thank you very much.